Welcome to session 4 of the New System Alliance. This week we are talking through all things systems change. And this session, the big one, the one the internet's been talking about, snakes and ladders, looking at the structural issues, the issues that are sometimes overlooked and forgotten about, and how we can focus on the wrong problem, forgetting some of the bigger issues that can cause such distress in people's lives. Today, we are fortunate enough to have such a fantastic panel of speakers who will be here to share their experiences in a raw and unscripted way. In a moment, I'll introduce who they are, I'll introduce myself, and then we'll go to those guys to give a little bit of insight into what puts the fire in their belly and what makes them show up to conversations like this to say their piece. There's an opportunity for everybody to engage, and we really encourage people to put their views and their comments and their questions in the comment bar on the side of your screen. I will try my best to interact with that throughout the session and bring you into the conversation so that you can feel a part of it. And we've also got a Q&A box as well, which will aim to answer specific questions. So if you want everybody to see what you're saying, put it in the chat. If you've got a specific question just for us, put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to respond. We're going to be talking for about 45 minutes to an hour, when we'll have a little break, a little tea break, and then we'll come back for some more questions after that. Think I've covered off housekeeping. Please be aware this is raw and unscripted. We don't know where the conversation's particularly going to go, so there may be things in here that are confronting and a little hard to hear. Please look after yourself. If you are struggling, you can always switch off, and please reach out for conversations if you want them. You can tweet, keep up with the conversation online, New System Ally, and of course, visit the newsystemalliance.org website, where you can see a copy of what is at the heart of these conversations, which is Wisdoms from the System, a listening exercise with hundreds of people across the system that have been impacted in different ways. So, without further ado, our panel. I'm going to introduce who they are and what they do, mainly by their website bios and their Wikipedia pages, but then we'll come to them to hear a little bit more of their personal stories. So we'll start with Bethan. Bethan Syed is a Welsh politician. She represents the South Wales West region. For Plaid Cymru, I had to look up how to pronounce it properly. I think it's Plaid Cymru. She's the Shadow Minister for Housing, Poverty, Communities and Steel, and we're so excited to have her with us today. Rebecca Pringle is a Senior Strategy Officer in Housing for East Lothian Council in Scotland, formerly working in the provider side and gone over to the commissioner side, the dark side, but don't hold that against her too much. Lucy Warin, she works for Transition by Design. It's an Oxford-based architecture and design co-op using participatory design. And Robb, amongst other things, as co-founder of the Repair Cafe in Belfast. And Lee uses this cafe as a vehicle to promote community, love and kindness. And for those that don't know who I am, my name is Robert White. I am a director at Mayday Trust, but formerly a commissioner in a Central London local authority responsible for rough sleeping services and supported housing design. So very much embedded in the system that we are talking about. So I've asked everybody to get hold of something, which can mean that they wave it around on the screen if they've got something to say. I've gone with my son's sound book. He ripped the panel off the side of the book so that he could walk around and press buttons like this and annoy everybody all day. So I will try my best to incorporate that throughout today. We'll start with Bethan. Do you want to introduce what puts the fire in your belly?
Hello, Shemai, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm just intrigued really to find out what you're launching with the New System Alliance and to find out what that means in practice. I'm a politician in Wales and I'm standing down next year. I've got a little son who's today 8 months old, and I just wanted to spend more time with him. But also I feel that a lot of the systems are working against me in terms of childcare and the lack of a job share. And I think quite often, you know, it's good to discuss these issues because sometimes we want to become part of systems that we can't because of life in general, and then how we need to change them so that they can accommodate a diverse community of people, and I don't think politics is that yet. So, you know, for me, that's what I want to try and challenge, is to how we break down boundaries in that way, because I still think, even though devolution has done a lot, it still has a long way to go. I was the spokesperson on housing. It's obviously an old Wikipedia page. I speak on higher education now, but I'm on maternity leave. But I loved the housing brief when I did it up until a few years ago. I did a lot of stuff on housing first and priority need in the housing sector, as well as passionate about mental health. So, you know, I'm happy to be here and part of the discussion, and hopefully I can learn from you guys as well, who are all part of some really good initiatives.
Thank you. Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
I will. I'll just unmute myself before you have to tell me I'm on mute. Thanks very much for having me today. So what puts a fire in my belly? Injustice, I suppose, at a really, really broad scale. But also then I have been so excited and energized by lots of new practices and ways of being that are starting to emerge over the last couple of years that are creating real change. And I suppose I'm trying to practice some of those myself. I think that actually lots of people that I talk to about this stuff, once we get through the initial layers, have a shared sense that there's something, like we've made a bit of a mess. And how we've designed those systems that we're all parts of in different ways, and have some understanding of how we can change them when we strip that stuff back. And then I came across Mayday Trust and the work they were doing, and it just amazed me, because it's actually really, really hard to transform organizations like that, and it's real work. And that's what puts a fire in my belly and keeps me going.
Good stuff. Thank you and welcome. Lucy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks for having me. Lovely to meet you all. Currently, I'm working for Transition by Design. So I'm a designer, mostly from the kind of housing background. So I find myself as someone who has a kind of foot in two systems that rub alongside each other and yet are strangely separated. So I'm someone who kind of knows more about housing and the built environment, but does a lot of that work on homelessness. So in Oxford, I run an action research project, which is looking at kind of responses to housing need, looking in particular about how we might utilise empty and underused space. But that is the kind of little system in which I work, but that leads to a number of other projects that kind of intersect with housing and homelessness. I'm really interested by systems, even if the kind of language of systems change sometimes makes my toes curl a bit. But I think that's a really interesting topic of conversation. I'm currently sitting within kind of two systems right now, being that the eagle-eyed will have spotted that I live on a boat. So one systemic impact of that is my internet is often a bit rubbish, so I apologise for that in advance. But on the other hand, a kingfisher just flew past my window.
It does look beautiful there, very idyllic. Thank you. And Rebecca?
Hi, I'm really glad to be here, despite the fact you introduced me as being on the dark side of this conversation. So yeah, my background is with the third sector, and now I'm with a local authority. So I very much come at this, I think, from a third sector point of view, and believe that local authorities are, you know, at the heart of systems change, whether that is pushing for change at higher government levels or within the communities. And we really need to be taking that central role and putting our hands up when services don't work, and saying, actually, we've made the wrong decisions for a while, and now we need to make sure that our services are fit for purpose, and really have that conversation, engage with local communities. So really excited to reflect on some of those things with everybody today.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we'll kick off with a point that I wanted to raise. As I said, this is the fourth conversation that we've had, and it's become really apparent in the other three so far, and I'm sure we'll continue to be part of that conversation and within wisdoms from the system, that we really need to offer choice and control back to the individual going through tough times. And we need to, as a system, back off and back away and let people make their own decisions and their own choices, and sometimes their own mistakes as well. But the system is geared up to intervene is geared up to protect with safeguarding and child protection and the Mental Health Act, Mental Capacity Act. So the question to you guys is, how do we avoid accidentally blaming the individual if we give them back the choice and control and things don't go right because of systemic issues like lack of housing, like the welfare system? How do we accidentally not blame them, and how do we make sure that we collectively call out systems and the problems and structural barriers that are there? Any thoughts on that?
So what does not go, things don't go right mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
That feels like a, useful starting point for me. Who's defining what goes right? Who's making those decisions about what things going wrong looks like? And who's feeling responsibility for those things? Like that, I don't work in housing, I don't work in those particular systems at the minute. But I think as a practitioner, it's really, really important to develop a reflective practice and understand what you're bringing to that relationship and into that system. And we've all got our own stuff going on, some of it unexamined, and we bring those into our relationships. And if you're designing systems, they can affect how you design those systems too. So that for me is a really important, it's not the only consideration, but it's our own individual practice if we're working in services, that we're really supported as well, that those systems have space for reflective practice and to really consider what things don't go right might mean for me as a practitioner, and what I'm then putting on to the people that I'm supposed to be supporting.
Absolutely. So straight away in from the chat, there's a question of who's it not going right for? Is it the system that it's not going right for, or the person and the individual? And how do you separate those things? I think so often we're trying to correct the system and not necessarily looking at what's happening for the individual. And
our own desire for control. We've all been, to some extent, brought up in an environment where we have been encouraged to take control of things in a way that then has become externalized in our relationships with other people. Mm-hmm. And it's a very human response, I think. It takes a real energy to not intervene and not try and fix a problem, and that's the issue around that epidemic of mass fixing that we so often talk about, and the desire to control people's lives. So do you think that do you think there is a way that you can safely remove some of those structural barriers and still let people be free? We talked this morning, a really interesting point from Mauricio on the conversation this morning was that he was working with somebody who very clearly was about to enter into a financially precarious situation with a loan that evidently wasn't going to be right for that individual. But he instructed his staff to not intervene and let that individual make that choice and ultimately make that mistake, because it was seen as a much better way to learn. But in the systems we operate now, that could be considered a financial safeguarding, and we must protect vulnerable people from making poor decisions. How do we square that off within the structures that we work in?
I think that's a really interesting example, because it's also the worker making the assumption that they know how that person is going to learn, or assume what they're going to learn from making that decision. I think often, individuals will want help, or they will, they will look for advice from services. And I think sometimes for services, it's about going along with the individual, the service user, and being there when they require that support. And where we are recognizing larger structural barriers in terms of if that's housing, if that's access to finances, that we're away doing that in the background, and making sure that those barriers are broken down at a much more strategic level, and just going alongside that person at the operational level to make sure that we are there when they need us.
I think a lot of it comes down to ideology, I'm afraid. We can talk about systems until we're blue in the face, but if you have a government or whatever layer they are with a specific ideology around housing or around mental health, then they will impose that on them. You're talking about the welfare system and what's happened to the changes there. That's a specific ideology that has been implemented to try and keep the working class down where they belong. I do a lot of work with asylum seekers. Now they've decided to put a lot of men in a former military base camp in Penally in Pembrokeshire, instead of asking those asylum seekers what would best suit their needs, because actually they don't care what suits their needs. And you have to live in a system that respects other people enough to do that. So I think we have to, it's not just about bureaucracy of how systems change, it's about where that core ideology comes from in enacting those policies. And I think, I would think my values are on the left, and I would want to be, if I was ever in government, putting forward policies that would have people at the heart of those decisions. I can't say if that would happen, as well as I'd like, but in an inspirational, ideal world, I would like to think that it wouldn't be me imposing just my views on people, although I would have a bit of that, because I've got privilege, I've got all these, this baggage from my past. But I would also like to think that we would be able to sit down and say, well, what do you want this system to look like? What role do you want to play in this? So it's very complex, but it's very interesting to pull apart as well.
How do you feel that we can create that voice from within, if it's not necessarily about tearing down those sort of structural barriers, but actually creating a vision and a value system from within? Do you have any views and advice perhaps about how people can make their point and instill those values?
I think it's really difficult. I think it depends on how people influence and take part in. It doesn't have to be party politics. It's political systems. Like many of you are involved in the third sector and charities and such. It's how we make decisions from the community up, so that when it comes to manifestos or when it comes to political parties, they've already heard those things because they're happening on the ground. I think sometimes it doesn't happen like that. It's the top level saying, oh, this sounds like a good idea, let's put it in there, as opposed to actually learning from the real life values on the ground. So it's a responsibility for us all to try and work together better, to try and make sure that those systems are not excluding people. And I get that it's hard, but that's why I'm here, to try and see how we can do that. I've done it in lots of different places in my region on a very small level where we've managed to make changes. But how can you make that into a grander scheme potentially, and how can you build that up into a mass movement?
Absolutely.
This is a really interesting point, and certainly should be kind of front and foremost for us as practitioners. So I think I'm a firm believer in the kind of methodologies of co-production and the inclusion of people with a lived experience and all that kind of jazz. But I also I build buildings. And so I have this kind of quite interesting challenge whereby I have to translate like lots of different diverse voices into something that isn't going to fall down. And so it's made us as an architecture practice have to think very carefully about what the kind of practical channels are for doing that. And what that quite quickly brings you round to is a kind of reflexivity and positionality of who you are, and therefore how you're interpreting what you've heard as lived experience and how you're translating it. And I think we do that fairly well. We've had a lot of practice at it and we think about it very hard, but I think it's a kind of even more interesting process to go through in relation to things like policies, and actually make sure that the practitioner is being reflexive of their role in that translation. And I think like the lens through which I think about it is that systems are always changing. Systems are always changing, and actually our role, rather than thinking of ourselves as system changers, perhaps we need to think of ourselves as stewards, and we've got this rather thankless job whereby if we fail, it's obvious and people are harmed. And if we succeed, our successes are tiny and often invisible, but we've succeeded in making something a bit better for a while. But I think with this kind of dogma of, you know, capital S, capital C systems change, and, you know, there's a goal which is to have changed it, I think that's an unhelpful lens through which to see it, because we're always setting ourselves up for failure.
And do you think that puts people off trying, or almost creates a division of not necessarily left and right, but that idea that you've got people who are trying to burn down the system and do it all again, and people who are trying to defend, saying, no, come on, we've got to pull ourselves together and make good with what we've got? It feels like an unhelpful kind of opposition to each other, and it's not necessary.
Oh, I don't think that, but I do think it helps and I do think it creates an unhelpful binary about who can or can't change a system, you know. So I think we have to be really careful of implying that you're either a systems changer or you're not, and that depends on your job title and who you work for. I think anyone can change a system. We just have to make sure that we're putting the frameworks in place so that that can happen.
Absolutely. Some fascinating conversations coming through the chat. Lee, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, I suppose. I think, you know, what's really important in my experience is that people working within systems get to bring their own humanity to work. And that's not my experience of most workplaces currently. And so we kind of have to leave our humanity at the door at 9 o'clock, like before all this, when we used to go to offices and stuff. And certainly my experience working in those kind of systems was that kind of by Friday at 5 o'clock, you find it quite hard to get your starter motor going again and tap into your humanity, and because you've been asked to turn it off for most of the week, and maybe implement decisions that didn't feel right. And you're trapped in hierarchical systems where the power relationships make it really difficult to voice that it doesn't feel right. And can we explore that in more detail, please? And so that to me is the and also I think just in terms of that lived experience conversation, like everyone has lived experience, and you know, if we can tap into that. I used to work for a funder, and so for example, they might be interested in talking to carers of people with dementia, but there was never any acknowledgement within the funder that there were people who were carers of people within dementia who were also employed by the funder. And that's not, you know, don't necessarily have to disclose every bit of your private life to your employer. And certainly if there's like some serious power imbalance going on, you might not want to do that. But it seemed to me a missed opportunity. And that kind of separating of ourselves out as a work person and a life person, you know, even that work-life balance is, we've just kind of accepted that's a thing, and it's weird. And that kind of, you know, and so that means that it's more difficult to see other people as whole people, because we're not whole when we're doing the work. And like that, it's a big ask and it's a bit scary, but I think it's absolutely necessary to bring about the changes that are required.
I totally agree with you, Lee. I think, you know, in local government, sorry, my cat just decided to make an appearance. You know, in authorities, you know, we consult, and so I meet with lots of different lived experience groups, whether that's care experience young people, women who've experienced domestic abuse, and again we're asking people to relive their traumas for us to create a better service. And actually, if we can't go along and give a little bit of ourselves to them as well, to make them see that we're human, then I think, you know, we're really losing out. And I think that connection is really important, because we are all service users, you know. We sit on local authority boards, but at the same time, you know, I use mental health services. I, you know, forgot to pay my council tax when I moved into my flat, so I was on the phone to council tax whilst also emailing them about work things, you know. So there's lots of different overlaps that I think need to be recognised, and that's from both within local authorities and out with, when people are looking in as well at people who are making these decisions.
I think that's fair to say, but I think in politics, for me, I think that lots of people may say that they want to hear what we've been through as humans, but quite often you can find that there's a backlash because they always see it as a them and us type of situation. So, you know, when I said I was standing down next year because childcare issues, you know, the abuse I would have got from lots of people about the perception of my life that they have just because I'm in the public eye. And so I want to open up and I want to be honest because that's the type of person I am. But sometimes you've got to close that off because you know that that's not always appreciated. But I would go to a community meeting or I'd go to a group locally and I would always try and be as honest and as human as possible, just because that's how I've always operated politically. But sometimes actually that works against you. So I just think there's sometimes a risk in that. Somebody asked about the stuff that I'd done with eating disorders. I mean, I don't think that it's like a panacea, but I just got, you know, service users involved. I got carers, we got professionals, consultants, and we basically wrote the eating disorders programme for the Welsh Government because there was none at the time in 2007. And I think because there wasn't a policy already in place, you could actually say there wasn't a system. So we were creating the system from scratch. And so that gave us a wealth of opportunities to be different, to engage with people who had never been engaged in these processes before. So I think that's where I've enjoyed doing this work, if you want to call it system work, because it was entirely new and you could be as creative as you want. But I don't like doing it is where you've got to try and tweak or change things that are already there. You feel like people don't want to change because they've always been in power. They want things to continue the way it always has. So, you know, these are the things that will always throw up when we want to be creative and new and inspiring. There will always be somebody there going, nah, I don't want you to do that. How do we get over those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of having humanity in the workplace has struck a chord with so many people in the chat, I think, and it's really clear that it's such a hard balance to strike. A really interesting comment from Miranda in the chat, just saying that it's it's really hard within the workplace because we often can't easily say what we feel when we're doing something wrong, or be comfortable with not seeing the immediate positive impact. And the idea that the system is geared up to measure impact in people's lives and not measure the sort of human contact that we have with people or the interactions that we have with people. But comments further clearly stating about how people only become known to the system when there's a problem, and the whole deficit based functionality of the system means that we only really interact with people when they come with their hands out with a problem, and how do we turn that on its head and actually look at people's strengths and assets instead of just being so focused on those deficits. But throughout all of that conversation, there is also a very fair question to ask back on that is, how do we protect the mental well-being of workers who are dealing with heavy and upsetting things every day? If we're asking them to bring their true selves to the table, how do we also make sure that there's resilience within that team as well? Any thoughts on resilience for people?
Yeah, I have strong thoughts on resilience for people, which actually relates back to the previous conversation and a couple of things you said then, but also about kind of recognizing what's the limits of fixing. So to take like homelessness, for example, which is broadly the system that we're talking about. But for example, there was a government survey last month that found that for 68% of local councils, the biggest reason they cited for a failure to deliver against the HRA was a lack of affordable housing. So to what point can you ask people to take a strength-based approach and to do the kind of work that Mayday is doing brilliantly, but at what point do you go, well, actually what we're suffering from here is a broken housing system, and that's not something that any one person or any housing support officer can help with, and therefore, like, how do we do that systems change work? And I feel that there are real parallels to that kind of workplace resilience, in that you go, well, to what point are we dealing with an individual's coping capacity and the kind of policies that a workplace might put in place to keep their workers happy and healthy, and what's the point where we draw a line under it and say, actually, the problem is rentier capitalism and a chronic pandemic of mental health problems, and that's bigger than any one workplace can solve with good working policies. And I think for me, we've not yet got that middle layer of dialogue around how those individual practices, individual workplaces, individual practitioners work together to bring about broader systems change. And I think that's the point where we have to look to broader social movements, you know, be that Black Lives Matter, be that the environment movement, as to how we translate that into more robust societal change.
I agree with you, and sorry, just to say quickly, I think it was because the Welsh Government decided that resilience was their new buzzword a couple of years ago, and it just became this thing about how people can cope, and, you know, about coming down to the individual to make them. I think it was when communities first were coming to an end, and therefore in Wales, so the schemes that would help communities, in deprived areas, and it just became a buzzword for, how can you cope? How can you take yourself out of this yourself? So, I mean, yeah, perhaps there's a wider discussion on it, but I'm with you and Hilton on that. Sorry, I just was reading from the comments.
Yeah, no, that's great. Lee, you had a point?
Yeah, I would just, I suppose, like, the temptation is always to take it large, right? How are we going to change the whole system? How are we suddenly going to transform organisations into more human places to be? And that then is really overwhelming, and you kind of get stuck in that cycle of, oh, it's impossible. But the really simple thing at the start of a meeting is a check-in to see how everybody is, right? It's 10 minutes, and it's just, and so people, you know, how are you feeling this morning? My journey to work was atrocious. I'm in a really bad mood. I was up all night caring for my parent. I am having a really great day, and I'm high on life at the minute. And that, sharing those things at the start of a meeting, in my experience, transforms the general vibe of the meeting. And if someone who is kind of, you know, sometimes you go out of a meeting, you would go, why were they being a dick to me in that meeting? And they weren't. They just were up all night with their elderly parent, and you don't, it's not about you. But that's the way we tend to interpret it. And that extra contextual information and taking some time to connect with each other's humanity totally changes the tone of the meeting and how we work together and how we interpret what happens at that meeting as well. So, like, those are, you know, that's just a really small example of something that you can start tomorrow if you're running a meeting. And it doesn't need approval. It doesn't need a new HR policy. It just takes some time to check in and see how people are, and create some space for, you know, just that other stuff that's going on to come into the room and see that it can help.
Do you think we have lost some of the ability to do that because of the world of Zoom calls and lack of human contact? I was listening to a podcast yesterday with Benjamin Zephaniah, and he's talked about how he's lost the ability to read people's body language and just ask how they are, because it's just a 2D screen all the time. But I guess it's still...
I think certainly, like, it's really, you know, I haven't been to a meeting yet where anybody has worked out how to do that weird bit where everyone arrives at the start and is quiet, and where we'd normally be maybe grabbing a cup of tea and saying, how are you? And what brought you here today? Those types of things. So I think we definitely, you know, there's work to do and finding out how to do those things together. I try to kind of say hello to people in the chat. I think if you're holding a meeting, then, you know, find a way to allow people to connect in some way, or give people something to do when they arrive. I was listening to a podcast from a woman, I can't remember her name, The Art of Gathering, and, you know, talking about how to create those spaces, those, you know, kind of human spaces. So there's, but like, with loads of work to do, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it just depends how you see. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Benjamin Zephaniah, but I think it's just communication in a different way. I mean, I have counselling every week. Just it helps me on my mental health, and I have it via Zoom now. And I don't see that it impinges on me. I just feel it's a different type of communication with somebody. And sometimes you can be more intimate as well, because you're not in a room where you might feel that it's a very small room, it's very claustrophobic, and it's very intimidating. So I think it's just how we can cope, and it's not going to suit everybody in every circumstance, but I think it will become this new normal that we're all going to be embracing. And how do we do that in a caring and considerate way? I mean, that's all up for discussion because it is so new.
I have a question for everyone, which is, because I think it's such an important point, and actually like just to quickly share like sort of maybe my personal journey of like why I'm here, was like I kind of started like, teenage activist, right? That was like activism and campaigning was my bread and butter. And then, straight out of university went into kind of, like exciting environmental and kind of sort of international and national stuff, and would get home at the end of the day and be like, oh, I think I influenced something, or like getting stuff in the media and like seeing people talking about the work that you're doing. And then I got like totally disillusioned with it and was like, this is not how I get people to care about climate change. Like no one's listening, like who am I? And so I like took some time out, did some different things, and then went right back to like community organizing and was like, do you know what, like I've never changed anything I've thought or done because someone else has told me to change. I've changed because I've seen someone else who I love, respect, admire doing it in a way that I love, respect, admire, and I've changed my own behavior to be more like them. And so it made me really kind of like readdress like what my community was, and for me that was mostly around like the kind of LGBTQ community, and I was seeing the kind of rates of homelessness and going up, and it was my friends who were all renters having a terrible time with housing, and that's kind of how I got into sort of more like deep community organizing with the people that I connected with. But now I've kind of gone a full circle, right? So now, like kind of having done that for a while now I see all these figures, like, I spend a lot of time talking about housing and renting. So these are the figures I know, but, I know that renters spend 1/3 of their income on their housing compared to about 17% of mortgage holders. I know that like 68% of renters say they have no savings. And then again, like if you look at it from a kind of women's perspective, like, the majority of rough sleepers are men, but actually the majority of statutory homeless are women. And then when you look at the kind of policy decisions of the last 10 years of like rolling back on benefits and welfare spending, and then chucking all this money at rough sleeping, like suddenly you start seeing how your small community organizing, your kind of micro connections relate to this bigger picture. And I can feel myself now pulling back to that bigger picture, that kind of bigger systems change. And at the same time, I've continued to be involved in activist networks. I work for a cooperative, and so these kind of check-ins, kind of consensus-based decision-making, like bringing your whole self and your humanity to work, have been my bread and butter. And so I can feel through my lived experience the power of connecting those small actions to those big statistics. And I get great energy from it, I get great fire from it, and I think it leads to like effective work. I hope it leads to effective work. And so like my question is like, this is the basis of my systems change work. And so my question to kind of you guys is do you connect with that? Like, do you have that same kind of changing of scale, and like maybe what's been your journeys to this kind of work?
Who's going to go?
You go.
Okay. So yeah, like totally that dance between, well, I don't know how it's the local and the global, that all, so one of the things I do is help run a repair cafe in Belfast, and that is about systems change connected with the climate emergency, right? To totally change our relationship with our stuff. But our repair cafe, I suppose, is founded on the basis that real change is about our change in our relationships with each other. that will be the catalyst that will fundamentally change how we live our lives, including how we consume or don't, and our approach to things like repair. So like, we love repair and it feels really amazing. It kind of feels quite magical when you repair something, and when you're with other people all repairing stuff at the same time, there's this thing that happens which could be called collective effervescence, which is like a sociology Durkheim term, which is like just really amazing, kind of keeps you going for the rest. So we do it for like 3.5 hours on a Saturday morning, and like you just glide through the rest of the week. Or you've had a really terrible week, and this is the best of humanity here in our repair cafe. And so what I was thinking about when you were talking about your experience is that what we have learned from the Repair Cafe is people are desperate for solutions, right? They want to be able to fix their stuff. They don't want to throw their stuff away. They don't want to treat it like it's disposable, but they don't know what to do. So we provide a small solution for 3.5 hours on a Saturday morning when we're able to run repair cafes. And we have started then conversations with Department of the Environment here in Northern Ireland. And they don't understand that. They think that their job is to change everybody's behaviour. But we're saying, no, people want to change. They just don't have any options. Give people alternatives. And that's from what we're doing on the ground on a Saturday morning in a community hall in Belfast. But then taking that up the chain and trying to influence then how policies developed and what they choose to spend their money on. And by saying this is not about putting a sign on a bus stop. This is about investing in communities and creating real connections between people, because it makes us feel good when we come together and we do stuff like repair and other stuff, not just repair. And that those fragmentation of communities and this individualistic lifestyle that we have, and then that relationship with consumerism, is harming us, and it's harming our relationships with other people. And we think if we repair our relationships with other people, that's part of the process. I hope that, so that definitely that dance between those two elements.
Yeah, I think for me, I started off doing frontline homelessness work, and I found after 4 years I was getting so frustrated with, and that was, you know, I wasn't even going through the system, I was just witnessing lots of other people going through the system, and I just was so frustrated by seeing the same problems people coming up against again and again and again. And at that point I thought, you know, I could be with somebody every time they go to make a homeless application, or they're looking for different housing options. But is that changing anything, or am I having to repeat that every single time? And so that was my sort of decision then to go into more sort of strategic work, where actually I'm now in the middle of a system. I don't get that I feel good fluffy feeling that much, and it is that constant fight about policies, about Bethan, a bit about what you'd said before about trying to tweak things that are already happening and trying to influence that, but also go into those community groups like yourselves and seeing what are you guys seeing on the ground, how are we not working for you guys, and how can we change our systems. So I definitely think there has to be that overall strategic view of the wider system and the structures and the barriers that are there, while also other people at that ground level tackling the everyday struggles that people face.
Well, I got involved, like Lucy, mostly in university, getting involved in international campaigns against the Iraq War, organising demonstrations against top-up fees in university, and as a student president in Aberystwyth, campaigning against open cast mining, lots of environmental issues. And I never envisaged going into mainstream politics, as you'd put it. And because I was elected at 25, people thought I was what was called a career politician, but I never ever have seen myself like that, because it's all about the activism, and it's about bringing in that activism into a more structured environment. So it was like, what can I achieve in politics, being elected, that I thought I could achieve when I was doing activism anyway. I never saw going on a protest or organising a demo as any less effective than standing up and giving a speech to 1,000 people at a party conference, because they all have their part to play, but in different ways. But I'm standing down next year, and partly that's because I felt I've lost a bit of my mojo. I've lost a bit of that creativity that activism gives. And I think once you get to that stage in elected politics, then you think, well, you kind of see the writing on the wall. And I didn't want to be one of these people that was going to be there forever just because. I think, there's lots of new people that can come through. So I'm actually looking forward to not being elected, because what I find the most rewarding is going into an asylum seeker group or going into a community group and seeing them be able to change their own lives. Yes, I might be helping them in the start. And, I'm sorry if sometimes people might think that's a bit patronizing, but, some people are starting from scratch. They've never run a campaign before. And then the growth you see in that community group is so rewarding. And so doing things like that, next year or when I've got time, would be something I'd really enjoy, because I think sometimes we just try and tell people what they need to do, as opposed to saying, do you know what, I'm going to muck in with you. And I don't see enough politicians doing that, just getting out the paper, making a poster, doing all the fun things as well, so that we can truly be part of the community, not just come in and out as we please, or not just come in and out as it suits our electoral or political agenda. So yeah, that's where I come from anyway.
And it's really clear to me that the influencing through doing, the activism on the ground is what gets people fired up, what gets people excited, and helps people be able to reflect and look at what the systems challenges are in front of us. So putting a question back at focusing on individuals going through tough times that are faced with a system that labels them as complex needs and labels them with deficits. How do we work alongside people to identify system barriers and bring in the wider context so that they don't internalize their own failures and don't internalize it being their fault? How do we help people become their own activists and their own speaking out against what's happening to them?
I think a lot of times people know that there's wider barriers at work. I don't think people are totally naive to that. I think they're aware of where systems haven't worked for them and where they could have worked better. And I think yeah, we need to continue to work with them and to bring that through. But totally lost my train of thought there. I will come back to it.
Any other thoughts on how we get people to have their own voice?
Robert, I'm going to do what I did to you earlier on. So I think I am extremely pedantic about this stuff, and I know you've been talking about language and that this week as well. So we're not going to get anybody to do anything. That, do you know what I mean? And like it's ingrained in all of us, to kind of really check ourselves about, because I suppose it gives away something about what we're bringing to that particular situation, and the things that we have learned about how to do this work, and that we, fundamentally, like I'm not doing this work, so it's very easy for me to talk about it sitting in my kitchen in Carrickfergus, but that the mindset and the kind of, there's something about a fundamental belief about human beings that needs to be expressed more explicitly, I think, around do we think all human beings are good? That, and then how does that drive our behaviors then? Or do we think all human beings need to be managed, or some human beings are good and some human beings need to be managed? And those kind of, like, exploring those kind of things, certainly within organizational settings and within services, I think are really important, because they start to inform how we relate to people that we're working with. And I with Lucy talking about her journey, so I kind of actively chose 3 years ago to change my life, to stop being part of the problem, and adopted a particular way, consciously adopted a particular way of relating to people. And like, it just really amazed me what you got back. And that, like, I could see change happening in front of my eyes because I had made a choice to be in systems, consciously be in systems. That's really hard to understand if you're not like as deeply connected with this stuff yet. Like, some of this stuff is a bit intangible, but kind of a consciousness that we're operating in systems, and how you behave and how you relate to other people has an impact and creates that change that Lucy's talking about, that flux that's going on all the time. And therefore I have a responsibility to behave in a particular way to try and help create the type of changes that I want to see. And that then, and when I practice that and see that, and I, like, I get tired and bad-tempered and fed up with people and angry and sweary and all that kind of stuff as well. It's hard work, but it also kind of reaps so many rewards. And when you treat people like actual complex, flawed human beings, just like I am, then you that's such an amazing experience for most people, because it's not what they tend to get. That they give you so much back, and it's such a rewarding relationship, and it creates change, because then their relationships with other people start to shift a bit as well.
I think it's also really important to make sure that people accessing services know that they have rights. They're armed with rights, and services have the responsibilities to react to those rights. And if somebody, we're saying, how do we get people to use their own voice? If you're going through a crisis, whether it's a mental health crisis, homelessness, it could be really difficult to use your own voice. And sometimes actually you need somebody else to be that voice for you. So whether that's through advocacy or through a worker that knows you and has been with you for a while, you need to almost, services need to be there as for people to rely on and go to for help, rather than to go to in crisis.
I think the point that was made, I think, by Lee in terms of doing things to communities is really important. I chair the culture committee in the Senedd, and we did an investigation into community arts projects. And what resonated me more than anything was a dance company that came in from a relatively deprived area of Cardiff, and they said, we are not hard to reach. We are doing these things every day with the community. It's just that you don't see it or you don't recognise it. And sometimes I feel that's where we have to step back, is that these things are already happening in communities. They are already supporting each other, except we always try to go in and fix it or put our views on it, and not try and just go, right, okay, what's already happening out there that we can just involve ourselves in. And I think that's where sometimes we patronize people in going in and how to get them involved, as opposed to, even if they've got, some communities come in and said, we've got this jewelry making class, and people from all different ethnicities come and just come in and make African jewelry, and then they end up then discussing other things, and they're teaching each other how to cook different foods from across the world. And so that opened up new ways of communication. So it's so interesting then to know that those things exist without us having any policy or any system approach to it whatsoever.
Absolutely. So what a fascinating conversation, and so interesting to hear people's examples of their experiences of the system that we operate in. We've been talking for 55 minutes, which has flown past. I did say that we'd have a bit of a break, so if there aren't any other final comments from the panel, we'll go to a break and then come back for some questions. So please keep firing questions into the chat, into the Q&A box as well. We'll take 5 minutes and come back at 3 o'clock. But I think, Bethan, you're going to have to leave us. So thank you so much. You've been
thank you, and keep me in touch with anything that you do, and good luck with everything. Pob luck.
Lovely. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, everybody, we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock.
modern teens. I ain't no psychiatrist, I ain't no doctor with degrees, but it don't take too much time to see what you're doing to me. You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Yeah, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Oh, freedom, 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 oh, freedom, yeah, freedom, now freedom, 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 need some freedom, oh, freedom, yeah, think about it, think about it, ain't nothing you could ask, I could answer you what I want, but I was gonna change it, I'm not if you keep doing things I don't, you better think about what you're trying to do to me, oh, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. People walk around every day playing games and taking scores, trying to make other people lose their mind. Well, be careful you don't lose yours. Oh, think about what you're trying to do to me. Woo-hoo. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. You need me, and I need you. Without each other, ain't nothing even can do. Oh, think about it, baby. What you trying to do to me? Come on, baby. Think about it right now. Yeah, right now. Oh, think about it right now. Think about it, baby, baby. Oh, to the bone, baby. You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Let's go back, let's go way on, way back when. I didn't even know you, you couldn't have been too much more than 10. I ain't no psychiatrist, I ain't no doctor with degrees, but it don't take too much time to see what you're doing to me. You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Yeah, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Oh, freedom, 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 oh, freedom, yeah, freedom, now freedom, 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 need some freedom, oh, freedom, hey, think about it. Think about it. Ain't nothing you could ask, I could answer you what I want, but I was gonna change it, I'm not if you keep doing things I don't. You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Oh, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. People walk around every day playing games and taking scores, trying to make other people lose their mind. Well, be careful you don't lose yours. Oh, think about what you're trying to do to me. Woo-hoo. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. You need me, and I need you. Without each other, ain't nothing even can do. Oh, think about it, baby. What you trying to do to me? Come on, baby. Think about it right now. Yeah, right now. Oh, think about it, right now. Think about it, baby, baby. Oh, to the bone, baby.
Hello, we're back. Thank you for sticking with us. We've still got a few people that have stayed on with us, so it would be great to start firing in some questions. Lots of discussion in the chat about the term resilience, which is fantastic. I think we can write to Oxford Dictionary and get them to start changing some of those definitions. We've come up with some great ideas in there. So I wanted to fire a couple of questions out to start to eke out some of these structural issues and whether they're causing the problems that perhaps we think they might be. So a question around supported housing, which I guess might be a little bit more for you, Rebecca, than others, but please feel free to chip in. So there are, what, 50,000 people living in supported accommodation in hostels across, I think, just in England, and many more beyond that. And they pay, what, £200 a week minimum. So it becomes extremely hard / impossible to get work and be able to fund your accommodation as well as your life. So are we creating structural barriers by creating systems that make people depend on going into expensive solutions to end what's essentially not having a roof over their head, pushing people through supported pathways and preventing them from being able to access employment and ultimately a route out of the system? Is that something we experience, and is there a way to get around that?
So for me, I'm coming at this from a totally Scottish perspective. So I suppose my first question would be to really clarify what we're talking about when we talk about supported housing. For me, when I think of supported housing, I think of someone having full access to their own living room and kitchen and bathroom. But if we were speaking in terms of supported accommodation on a sort of larger scale, where where costs are very, very high, I think absolutely that is a barrier to some people seeking employment. But I think I'm not sure where the solution lies, but I wonder if actually it's about housing options. It's, you know, where we can't reduce that cost of that housing in the supported environment. You know, are we allocating those people to the right types of housing? Do they need that level of supported provision? And if not, you know, that's where we need to be delivering different housing options. I would also hope, I mean, I know in East Lothian we have quite a small provision of supported housing, sort of supported accommodation units. So during being allocated temp accommodation, we take into account if that individual is working to ensure that they can afford where we're placing them. Not saying we've got a lot of things still to work on, but I think it is absolutely vital that we take into account people's current situations and also allow them room to sort of grow. And, you know, the Scottish Government are bringing in personal housing plans for everyone who goes through homelessness. And I think employment needs to definitely be on that. If someone is seeking employment and has a firm, you know, and has that on the cards, then that needs to be brought into that personal housing plan. So the worker and the individual are both looking for that housing option that is affordable to them, that will allow them to work at that same time.
We've got a project live in Oxford at the moment, which is looking at meanwhile use, so finding empty and underused properties, mostly in Oxford that are owned by Oxford colleges, and then brokering peppercorn rents. So we've got a number of empty buildings through a project that we run called Make Space Oxford, which is about bringing empty and underused spaces back into community use. But we've got 5 properties next to each other, which are old hotels or B&Bs, which have been empty for a few years and would have been empty for another kind of, you know, period as part of a broader development plan. So we've managed to bring 2 of those online already and are now home to 12 people, and there's another 3 that we're bringing on and hope to house about 45 people within the next few months. And they're really, you know, I mean, as well as like kind of move on accommodation for people coming out of the everybody in cohort, the exciting thing is that peppercorn rent has allowed us to split the accommodation costs from the support costs. So actually the what those people pay to be in those homes is a very reasonable rate, which means that they can afford to get a job. So there's actually we've managed in these properties to break that kind of cliff edge of coming up, you know, off enhanced housing benefit and into employment, and we're already seeing the benefits in that in that house, in those 2 houses, and for me that's like a really good example of like why you have to question where the system ends, right? So, you know, this was being done within the kind of homelessness system and homelessness service providers and the homelessness team at the council, and it wasn't until we kind of like broadened out to think more about kind of housing in the built environment that kind of a solution like that came available. But the next question is then, where do they move on from there? And then you really have to start thinking about the private rented sector, you know. So like we you know, if we're not going to keep moving these things up one layer, then we have to kind of keep taking a systems-wide approach.
I don't know if you can see the chat, but a few specific questions coming through about that idea that you're talking about. So is it self-contained? What security of tenure do people have in those settings?
So I mean, again, this is really interesting. So with the kind of talking about kind of supported accommodation or move on accommodation, I really echo Rebecca's point about kind of what do you actually mean. It's interesting for me, coming from a housing background, where when we talk about housing, we talk about like either tenure or the typology. We're talking about, is it detached, semi-detached, is it new build, is it retrofit, and now suddenly within homelessness you've got these new categories of like, is it move on, is it supported, you know, is it a hostel or shelter? And I'm like, well, that's, you're not describing housing, you're describing a service. And so I sometimes provocatively quite like breaking down that whenever we can. And so the key point here about tenure type is I found it really interesting when I first started working in homelessness, where you'd get one person saying, I've been doing this for 40 years, I've been working for this homelessness charity for 40 years, and I promise you that there is no point in talking about temporary accommodation. And then you get someone else saying, I've been working in this homelessness charity for 40 years and I can tell you, absolutely promise you, that we've got to get good quality temporary accommodation. And there was like such dogmas from such different perspectives, all within the same kind of system and the same problem. And so one thing that we always really try and bring across is that actually, you know, none of us have security of tenure. You know, if you're renting, you've probably got a month break clause in your contract, and you could be kicked out at a month, and that's not ideal for anyone. And you probably, you know, you might well, if you're a private renter, move every 2-3 years. That's the kind of average. And yet we've got this kind of dogma within like the homelessness system, and especially the adult pathways, that it has to be more secure than that. And so while I completely understand the reasons for that, and certainly some of these people are people who need like real security and knowing that they're not going to be moved on at any point, there is a lot of grey area. And especially for the kind of rise in the homelessness problem which we've seen, especially in the last 10 years, it's a lot of, you know, it's a lot of single homelessness. It's a lot of people who come to the system with fairly low to no needs, but then often develop more complex needs through the system. And so what we're trying to do with this series of houses is challenge, actually, if you can adopt a rapid rehousing approach by having enough affordable available properties, then you can have more flex with tenure type, as long as the business model is right and you've got enough housing in order to be able to give people a home.
Sorry, can I just ask on the back of that? So is it, sorry, I suppose this goes against what you're saying, but is it temporary accommodation? Do people have to move on at some stage?
There's no limit on how long they can stay there, but there is a limit on the lease. So with Meanwhile Properties, it's a bit of a funny one, because you agreement from a landlord saying we'll give you a lease for a year, 2 years, but there is a real lack of security with the contract type. So, you know, they probably could turn around and kick us out a month. You've got the kind of weight of public opinion. So, you know, there would be certain PR issues around if they did that. But mostly we focus on brokering really good relationships with the landlords that we work with, and there's a kind of degree of trust. So for example, with these, we've got a 5-year lease, and we're not telling anyone that they need to move out before then. But the floating support that surrounds those houses, which is provided by a service provider that we're working in partnership with, is certainly designed at like getting them to move on at some point.
And in terms of do the individuals have tenancy agreements? Do they have rights to the area that they're staying in? Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Another question coming through. Let's have a look from Rebecca Nelson. The homeless systems we have created are expensive and ineffective. Do we need to fund so many services? Would it be more effective to give that money directly to communities and fund new and different housing solutions? What are our thoughts on that?
I think it is vital that communities are involved and that they have a say in what we create. But I also think at this moment in time, we have an absolutely brilliant wealth of evidence over knowing what works and what doesn't work. And I think there needs to be a joining of that evidence and that input from communities. I don't think we need to totally, there's no point in going out to communities and trying to totally reinvent the wheel. Your question there sort of also suggested that more services would then be developed by communities. And actually, maybe we need to be looking at the evidence, bringing the communities in and saying, okay, how are these services working? How are they not working? And how can we adapt them to make sure they are working?
Okay, so moving away slightly from housing and looking at mental health, big subject at the moment, particularly with lockdown and the idea that we are appearing to pathologize people as much as possible when really they seem to be reacting to fairly normal and stressful situations. So do we think that the increase and the need to pathologize people's circumstances is creating a problem? And how do we bridge that gap? Ollie poses the question of if we're working alongside someone with a mental health diagnosis and we work with them by listening, being human and similar, but the wider system traumatizes, medicalizes, stigmatizes and sections people, how do we even start to bridge that trauma gap? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's huge, and certainly I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that. And it is something that I suppose we need to continue to ask ourselves. I think there's, I'm interested in the pace of change, and sometimes in myself I notice a desire for people to be where I want them to be just because I want them to be there, and that we have a responsibility to take care of people through the system that we know doesn't work well for them. So we're, that it's a dance, right? And and then it's like, how do we support people who are supporting people, that are working in an organization that creates space for you to ask those questions within that organization and work them through with your colleagues that are going through the same things. And acknowledge that sometimes that might result in a bad call, but bad calls are happening now too. And so, like that, it's really important that we continue to reflect on that, I suppose, is the best that I can really offer. But it's not working at the minute. That's I suppose is the risk of doing nothing greater than the risk of trying to create change, is what I would be asking myself too. And also, and the other thing that's kind of on my mind is, so the way, like, all those Eton boys who are running the country all do PPE at Oxford, like, I'm generalising a bit, but unfortunately not too much. And so they have a framework by which to understand their conditions. And I really feel like most of us don't have much of a framework anymore by which to understand our conditions and what has happened to us. And a friend of mine, she works with an economist here, and they deliver a program called Economics for Ordinary People. And that gives people a framework by which to understand their material conditions, how the economy works and the impact on those individuals and each other, because you do it in community. And so those are some of the other things that I think we need to start thinking about, to help people understand what has happened to them and to externalize it. And not because so much effort has been put in to make sure that they internalize it, and that it has just become something that has happened to them that's probably their fault. And what other things can we do to help people to put their situation in a much wider context, that I think is liberating, can be really liberating, and can help us let go of some of that awful baggage that we're carrying around, doing ourselves harm every day by thinking that we created this situation for ourselves. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question there, but that has just been kind of on my mind as we've been having this discussion.
I think when
I could love to.
I was going to say, I think when we're talking about mental health, I think it's really important to kind of recognise that there's a sliding scale of mental health. So, you know, on the one hand, you know, we all have mental health and we maintain our mental well-being, if you like. And then there might be, you know, so that could be, you know, during COVID, when someone who has never experienced has never struggled with their mental health before would then recognise that they need to maintain that mental well-being, and they need to recognise that a bit more. And then at the other end, you have that you have mental illness, and I suppose that's what we're talking about here, is that have we you know, placed diagnoses on people that don't serve them. And I suppose the problem we then get to with that is that those diagnoses are also gateways to other things. So those diagnoses allow you to access certain benefits if you need them. They also open up equalities legislation if you need it as well. And so it's all trapped within a wider system. So if we're going to talk about redefining things, we need to think about all the other areas that will be affected by that.
I think it's really important that we're talking about these two things together in terms of mental health and this kind of the PPE equivalent of how we contextualize ourselves within a bigger framework. And I mean, to me, the answer is repair cafes. So I think I ran this project in 2017 and 18 called Open House, which was it was an empty shop in central Oxford, and we opened it for a year as it was called a public talking shop on housing and homelessness, and it was a really deliberate attempt to kind of confuse the boundary between this is a space for homeless people and this is not a space for homeless people. And if you're homeless, you're a member or you're a service user and there's rules, and if you're not homeless, you're a customer or a guest and here's a menu and a welcome. And so we really deliberately tried to create a space that was actively welcoming to everyone, no matter what their experience was. And then we filled that space with conversations about housing. And the idea was exactly this. It was about creating a citywide conversation on housing and homelessness in order to create a shared experience, in order to hear from people that weren't your friends. And then with the idea that that would lead to a kind of shared understanding and action. And this, you know, to hear you talk about that, Lee, about like PPE as this kind of pre-designed framework in which to understand your place in this broader system, that was the concept of Open House. That was, can we create a room in which people can come together to understand how their personal experience of housing relates to others and what needs to change. And one of the most vibrant things was, you know, it was like a public living room. You know, it was very influenced by MAF, POTS and Camarados and the wonderful work that they've done. But it was this very welcoming space to which a lot of people who because of their experience of poverty or homelessness, had rarely felt ownership over a space. They would come to us every day, they'd drink all our tea, they'd eat all our biscuits, and through that process they would create a sense of ownership. And then in the evenings we had events coming out of our ears, and we'd have the kind of speakers that you'd see around the corner on a college stage, but when it was with us it was rowdy and people could get involved, and you know, you really had this kind of vibrant conversation happening within different groups of people. And the journey that I saw people go on through that year, both in terms of understanding housing and situating their own experience within it, but also their own mental health, also their own confidence, also their own networks and their sense of agency and how they carried themselves when they walked out the door. I saw a transformational change in many people. And that project ran for a year and cost, I think total cost was about £18,000 for that project, which, you know, two of the people who used to come to us daily ended up going into quite long-term hospital stays when we closed. And I think those probably cost collectively more than the project cost to run for a year. So I think these two things are really pertinent that we think about them together. And I think the answer is repair cafes.
So do I, but also, so weirdly, I am just in the process of opening a talking shop in my my hometown, with it's a focus really on how do we create community-led regeneration, because the decline of the town centre is something that unites us. And I have kind of been facilitating an online conversation about that through Facebook for the last 3 years. And we just got some funding from the lottery to try out how do we have these conversations in person. And it's local democracy, it's how we understand the world, it's all those things kind of wrapped up in what was supposed to be a nice space for people to come and talk, but most of it's going to probably be online. But yeah, it's just interesting that you know, we've been involved in similar ideas.
Fantastic, thank you. There's lots of conversation in the chat about different texts to read, and lots of thinking and ultimately lots of evidence around why the traditional structures of the DSM and psychiatry appear to be causing more harm than good. So have a look at those. Please do have a read, and please do continue to share some of those texts. It's 3:20, so unless there are any other questions, I'll just go back around the panel for any final thoughts, and then we will wrap up. Anything else anybody would like to say?
I have one thing that is on my list of things to say that I haven't said yet. Just around, so we local government was reorganised in I think in 2014, something like that here, and the community planning processes were introduced, and I was at a community planning event with about 120 service providers a couple of years ago, and I have never heard the word vulnerable used so much in my life. And at the same time connected in with thinking around systems leadership and leaders, whoever they are, embracing their vulnerability and showing their vulnerability as a way of creating change within the system. And it just really occurred to me that how could we ever, if you are the chief executive of a service or work in a statutory agency that's delivering a service, and you're talking about helping vulnerable people all the time, how on earth can you ever claim to be vulnerable yourself when your role is to serve vulnerable people? And that I don't know what the answer to that is, but it just has really stuck in my mind that, you know, because this work is about leadership. You know, Pat has shown amazing leadership in the Mayday Trust. And it doesn't necessarily need to be leadership at the top of the organisation, but it is about modelling different behaviours and creating space for other people to behave differently. And that seems to me a really significant challenge for systems change in this particular space, because you can't show vulnerability when your job is to help vulnerable people.
Just to throw in a couple of more book suggestions when we were chatting about psychiatric diagnoses, The Great Pretender by Susanna Callahan is a great read for that, and so is Psychoanalytic Thinking on the Unhoused Mind, are both pretty good in terms of the drop the disorder arguments. I think for me, looking at systems change, I think it is vital that we don't forget about the evidence that already exists. I think that is one, you know, alongside lived experience, and making sure we're not overly relying on people having to retell their stories and rely on people feeling sorry for other people to make the right decisions. You know, we need to make sure that evidence is there, and that is mostly how we also change minds and change cultures and change systems.
Lucy, any thoughts from you at all?
No, just to echo what the others have said, and I think just to revisit that point of it's a job that will never be done, you know. And I think about you know, as much as we've changed systems going forward, you know, when you think about housing and homelessness, we're living in the homes that were built 50 to 100 years ago, and the homes we're building now are based on our understanding of what housing need is now and will be around for another 50 to 100 years. And so I think that's quite a good example of how whatever change we make, the context is always going to change, is always going to keep changing, and so we have to keep tweaking and moving forward as we do. It's a job that will never be done, and we just have to keep doing it with our best energy and with the right intentions.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much to Rebecca, to Lee, Lucy and Bethan, of course, as well, for joining us today. This is the New System Alliance. Sign up online, become an ally, and people asking in the chat already how we can continue this conversation. So let's take it online. Use the hashtag New System Ally and let's keep going. There are more conversations to come. There's going to be a fascinating debate tomorrow on language. Lee, I suggest you are there for that. And there will be more at 2 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow, and further sessions on Friday as well. The Wisdoms from the System is now available online as well, so please take the time to read that and reflect on that as well. And thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Have yourselves a good day.
Bye.